Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's afternoon, or your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it.
All right, so our case for today and also just our cases for the next couple of weeks will actually highlight people coming out of Georgia. So if you from Georgia, stand up, what up? But our case is in Lithonia. And I always feel very weird saying that because it feels very country and I feel like I should be saying something else. But you guys have corrected me so many times. I'm just going to embrace that. Now, originally, we have Ricky and his wife Pamela, who are coming from Jamaica, and they came to the States to start a new life. They weren't strangers to hard work. Pamela eventually found a job as a travel agent, and Ricky was in and out of different jobs, but they were determined that they were going to make a better way for themselves. Ricky already had a child named David that he brought in from another marriage, but together, Pamela and Ricky had a child together named Derrick Jr. Now, this kind of threw me for a loop because we know him as Ricky. And I'm like, well, you can't be a junior unless somebody's named Derrick. So I want to just go on record and say I'm not sure if like maybe his first name was Derrick and they called him Ricky. We do that sometimes.
We do, we
But
do.
for whatever reason, they had a cohesive family together. And by the time David and Derrick Jr. were teenagers, Ricky went ahead and started a landscaping company. And he just kind of built his company from the ground up, kind of like a grassroots type of thing. He knocked on doors, mowed lawns, and because of his great reputation and good business skills, his business thrived. And then he began to just build up. That's what Ricky did with his landscaping business. He eventually added on more crew, and before you knew it, he had employees and he had a successful, thriving business. And he began to rise to the top. Now, Pamela and Ricky just enjoyed a very humble beginning, if you will, but eventually they purchased their first home, graduating into middle class, starting up from the working class, and eventually made the American dream, or what we think the American dream is. Ricky made their landscaping business into a six-figure business. He landed business deals, not just, mowing residential areas, but then eventually got businesses on board and had six-figure landscaping projects. And because their business was so successful, Pamela left her job and joined the company in 2009. They achieved success and were satisfied with their home and the business they established. That was until, and if you watch TikTok, there's this guy that I love to watch, and he does animation, but he says everything
Uh,
was good
until.
until 2 a.m. in Lithonia, Georgia, DeKalb County. 911 receives a frantic phone call, and the woman on the other end of the call said that she heard somebody downstairs. She was frightened, and she heard somebody while she's on the 911 phone call was ransacking through her home. Now, she said her husband was downstairs fighting off the intruder, and she could hear them from the closet. While she's on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, she hears downstairs her husband say, "Get the gun." But she's kind of tied in between the two because she doesn't know if she should be getting the gun or she should be listening to the 911 dispatcher. Now, if you guys listen to our paid subscription this week, and if you haven't, go ahead and check out that 3-day free trial. Got to put the plug in. But I talked about 911 dispatchers, and I think sometimes we can get very frustrated with them, especially as true crime sleuths. We've listened to a dozen of 911 phone calls ourselves, and we're just like, why are you asking that question? Like, what is happening? But they're doing their due diligence, right? Like that's a part of their protocol. And so the 911 dispatcher is talking to this woman and she says, "Hey, listen, you can't go downstairs. I know your husband is calling down for you, but you have to stay safe. And I need you on the phone with me until the police officers arrive." So she's constantly asking to go downstairs, but she doesn't because she's following the rules and the protocol that the 911 dispatcher gives. Now, if you haven't guessed it by now, the person on the other end of the phone call is actually Pamela, and it is her husband, Ricky, who is downstairs. Simultaneously, she's talking to the 911 dispatcher, clinging on for dear life, tied in between if she should go downstairs and help her husband. And at this point, her husband directly calls for her. He says, Pamela, come downstairs. But she waits. And eventually, the police officers and EMT arrive on scene, and the 911 dispatcher says, they're there. I need you to go downstairs, open your front door, and let them in. And so she does. Not paying attention to anything that's in the foyer, she immediately lets officers in. And when they get inside of the residence, they see nothing but blood and Ricky lying in the foyer. And it was full of blood. I'm trying to paint a picture for you guys. The floors was full of blood. The walls, think blood splatter. It was everywhere. And Ricky was badly bleeding from his head. Now, eventually they get Ricky on a gurney and they hurry up and try to get him to the hospital. And right before they get him in, Pamela is begging for, EMT and police officers, let me onto the ambulance. Like, I want to ride with him, which is your right, right? Especially if you're next of kin or you're that person's significant other. But honestly, the police told her, no, we need you to stay here because since Ricky is obviously unable to talk to us, you're our eyewitness. You're the person that we need to speak to in order to hear what happened. And I just can't imagine, MD, you can tell me your thoughts, what her thoughts were, right? Like, not only did she have to wait upstairs as her husband is obviously fighting this intruder downstairs and calling for her, but once she gets downstairs, he's quickly rushed to the ambulance, and then she's thinking she can ride with them, and they're like, nah, sit down, we need to talk to you. I mean, how do you think your frame of mind would be during an ordeal like that? Or would
Well,
shock just take over?
yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't even know if I would have been able to stay upstairs on the phone. Like, I don't know if I would have been able to follow the 911 instructors' instructions. So that's number one. Although
Mhm.
I understand why she did, and I don't think it's wrong that she did, especially when he called out for her. I feel like that would have just been like, I'm just gonna have to die. Like, like, I mean, in my mind, I feel like that's what I would think I would
Sure.
do. And of course, you don't really know what you would do until you're in the situation. But I feel like I would have fought like tooth and nails to get on that gurney to go with my husband. Like, I don't care.
Yeah.
Y'all, we all going. Y'all get this
Talk to
statement
me.
at this.
Right.
Yeah,
Talk to me
right.
at the hospital.
Talk to me on this like talk to me in this ambulance. I don't care what's
Right.
about to happen, but what is not happening is me staying here with you to give you a statement. That's what's not going to happen.
Right. So
So
I'm interested. Yeah, I hear that. And I
yeah,
think I side on your on your advice or what you think you would presumably do. But I'm asking you guys, what would you do in that scenario? And this eventually comes back into play. Now, the night, according to Pam, was ordinary. She got home from the gym and Ricky was sitting in his chair. And if you got a papa or grandpa, or even a dad, like they usually have their seat in the living room. And he was sitting in his chair, surfing the internet, looking at TV. And she went ahead, gave him a kiss, and said she was going upstairs to take a shower. And eventually, she woke up at 2 a.m. and Ricky wasn't in the bed. And this wasn't unusual. Sometimes Ricky wouldn't be in the bed, he would fall asleep downstairs. So she didn't really think that was unusual. So she just got up and went to the restroom, kind of, routinely what we all do. And as she's finishing up in the restroom, she hears sounds coming from downstairs, like as if someone was moving about. And she calls out, Ricky, but Ricky doesn't answer. And then she hears somewhat of a struggle downstairs, like as if Ricky's struggling with someone. And that's when Ricky begins to speak to her and says, get the gun. Ricky kept a handgun in the nightstand by their bed. But she didn't go and grab the gun. She was just too afraid. She locks herself in the bedroom and she says it kind of goes silent for a while. She doesn't hear any fighting. And so she leaves the room and goes to the closet. But before she goes to the closet, she grabs the phone. And so that's when she starts talking to the 911 dispatcher, and kind of where we walk into the scenario when she calls 911. She was feeling terrible. At this point in time, Ricky was rushed off to the hospital, and overall, she felt guilty. She felt guilty for the very reason that we talked about. She felt like she should have went downstairs when he called for her. She felt like she should have grabbed the gun. She felt like she could have just overall done more in that situation with her husband. But police officer says, well, okay, thank you. They gave all the information, and now from that point on, they were trying to canvass the area. But Pam, she was on her way to the.
Now, and they would drive Pam to Grady Memorial Hospital when it is determined that there's nothing left that can be done for Ricky. He was struck in the head with a blunt object, and he was on life support, but at the end of the day, he's brain dead. And so Pam and her adult sons, they did request that no further emergency measures be taken to try to save Ricky's life, which I totally understand, because if you're brain dead, what else can be done? You don't want your loved one to be in a vegetable like state. The charges at this point is upgraded from assault to homicide. And they believe that it did start off as a robbery that went wrong. They did find blood splatter throughout the first floor of the house. Like Steph said, like blood was everywhere. And they found a decorative statue that was smeared with blood. And the detectives believe that this was likely the object that was used to beat Ricky in the head. Now, one of the things that also pointed to the fact that this looked like it was a robbery is that they found pry marks on the back door, which led detectives to believe that these robbers didn't expect anyone to be downstairs. They're breaking in to this back door thinking that it's going to be easy, we're going to get what we want and get out. Nothing, though, was missing. And although sometimes that can make us believe that maybe this was looked like it was a stage robbery, in this particular case, because the detectives believe that they weren't expecting somebody to be downstairs, and in this case, Ricky was downstairs, the robbers came in expecting to rob, was faced with Ricky, had a fight with Ricky. That fight was obviously gruesome and deadly. And the robbers, they didn't have time to try to grab anything. They just left. So at this point, police are kind of just piecing everything together. They start canvassing the area. They're talking to neighbors, and the neighbors are they are completely upset, and they're frightened by what looks to be a potential threat. The neighbors were upset, and they were frightened by like what they're trying to figure out. Like, is this like an ongoing situation? Do we need to do some things to protect ourselves? Like, they're trying to figure it all out. The crime rate was low in Lithonia. Everyone that the detectives spoke to confirmed that, this area was middle class Americans that had things going for themselves, and everyone that lived in the area, they were kind. People talked to one another, they knew their neighbors. This was not like an area where you would expect something like this to happen. In addition to all of that, nobody saw anything. Nobody saw anybody looking suspicious, looking out of place, looking like they had no business being there. But one neighbor did say that they noticed an SUV, a black SUV, parked by Pam and Ricky's house on several occasions. And it just seemed like it was out of place. Like, just like it looked like this black SUV was creeping, maybe following or keeping eyes on the family. And they did notice that. And it's one of those things that it's a hindsight recognition after something has happened. Like, you peep it, you notice it, you tell yourself you write it off as being not a big deal. But then after something happens, you're like, oh no, this is a bigger deal than what I expected. Now, at this point, detectives, they finished their canvassing. It's about 10 a.m. the next morning. Ricky now has officially passed away. Pam comes in for a formal statement. And according to Pam, she tells police that Ricky doesn't have any enemies. Like, there's nobody that I can think of that would even do this to Ricky or want anything like this to happen to Ricky. So detectives are left trying to piece this thing together because they don't have an eyewitness in the neighborhood. They don't have any leads. And Pam is saying that there is nobody that she can even point them to that would do this.
They obviously go to the next of kin, which would be his sons, and they talk to Derrick Jr., the son that Ricky shared with Pamela, and he tells investigators that his father Ricky had a girlfriend named Carolyn Hodges, and she was an old family friend, but they met up once again when they went to a family funeral. And he claimed that his dad wasn't discreet about this affair. And Derrick Jr. said he tried to tell his mom, but his mom kind of just brushed it off, said it wasn't a big deal, didn't really believe him. Investigators pulled Ricky's phone records and they discovered that there were several late night phone calls between Carolyn and Ricky, even on the night of his murder. They bring her in for questioning, and while they talked, they discovered that Carolyn mentioned that, yeah, I knew Ricky. We talked often, but Ricky was a friend and we had a friendship. And she said that their friendship evolved into more conversations because Ricky wanted her advice because he and Pam were going through a rough patch. And that rough patch was experienced mainly because Pam was the one having the affair. Detectives are kind of like, what is happening? We went to one affair into another. And they find out that Pam had an affair with a fellow police officer named Antonio Vargas. They met at a gym. They went to the same gym. And the detectives immediately decided to try to figure this out to corroborate one, Carolyn's story on where she was, and they couldn't necessarily confirm if they truly had a friendship or not, but they could figure out where she was on the night of the murder. And they also brought in Antonio Vargas. And Antonio Vargas admitted that he was working long hours and he was actually out on a job as a police officer the day of the murder. And he said, yeah, I did have a fling with Pam, but her husband was off his job, wasn't paying her enough attention, and I gladly filled in for him. But it wasn't an affair like you're trying to make it out to be. It literally was just a fling. But they had to check all of this out. So they check out Carolyn's phone records and they discover that she was in Virginia on the day of the murder or the night of the murder. So they were able to discount her as a suspect. And they were able to affirm that Antonio was out on a job the night of the murder. I mean, they could confirm that through his employer, the police department, right? How convenient. But the other thing that they discovered is that Antonio Vargas owned a black SUV, similar to that black SUV that the neighbors said they saw in the days leading up to the murders. They brought Antonio back in again, and he denied having anything to do with Ricky's death. And he claimed that, I was away. I never went by their house and, just to scope out the property. That wasn't me. I had nothing to do with it. And they couldn't prove that it was his SUV. It just happened to be like this very convenient coincidence, if you believe in that. The investigation went on with them ruling out Caroline and also Antonio.
Ricky's son David arrived from Boston and he came in and he gave his own confession about Pamela, not only about her affair, but how she was taking some money off the top from the business. Now, when David talked about how he would review the books, he observed that there were some just discrepancies, some irregularities. And when he shared them with Ricky, his dad just kind of dismissed it. No, you don't know what you're really saying. You don't know what you're really talking about. Now, it was only when he encountered some difficulties paying the bills, finally, Ricky noticed the discrepancies and he started to pay a little bit more attention to what David had to say. And at that point, Ricky was ready to file for divorce. Once he realized all that Pam was doing, the scheme, taking money from the business, he was done. He was ready to file for divorce, but he didn't reach out to an attorney to file for that divorce just yet. Now, there was a life insurance policy because there's always a life insurance policy in cases like these. And he actually had increased that policy to more than $1 million before he died. David explains to the police that if Ricky had filed for divorce, if his father had filed for this divorce, then that policy where he increased it for more than $1 million would become null and void as to her being the beneficiary. And so he believed that because she knew he was going to divorce her, because she knew that he wanted to divorce her, that she was responsible for ensuring that Ricky died. He basically is like letting the police know, I believe she has something to do with this. And I believe this is the motive. It's to get this money. But there was no forensic evidence to actually connect her to the crime. And so they're listening to what David is saying, and they're like, okay, he has some valid points, and this seems to be lining up. However, we have nothing to tie her to this. So they bring Pamela in for another interview. And in that interview, she confesses like, yes, it was Ricky that increased this policy, not me. And I had nothing to do with that. That was all on him. And no, I didn't admit to having an affair, because who wants to say that in a police interview when their husband is dead? She's like, I didn't want to air out my dirty laundry. I didn't think that that was relevant. So she kept to her story that, she was on the phone, an intruder came in. Now, at the end of the interview, they arrest her for murder. People were shocked that Pamela was responsible.
Now, I just want to highlight to you guys again that there was no forensic evidence to tie her to the murder. This was very much a circumstantial case. And they could not even draw back the fact that Ricky wanted to get a divorce because he didn't file anything. He didn't meet with an attorney. So this was all alleged by his son. And so they didn't really have anything to tie back to her other than the circumstantial evidence that they had collected. And it obviously was very strong because they arrested her and she went to trial June of 2014. Now, prosecutors allege that Pamela was the only person with the motive because of the divorce and the life insurance policy. And obviously, she was unhappy. This is what made her kill him. Now, they maintain that she wanted to get out of the marriage, and they also pointed to the affair because of that as well. They alleged that Ricky was asleep in the recliner and she crept up behind him and grabbed the statue that MD told you about in the beginning of the case and attacked him with the first blow. He became incapacitated, and once he was down, she dragged him to the foyer. She faked a home invasion because not only was Ricky pulled to the front of the foyer, but also there were tons of things that were ransacked throughout the house. So this was definitely a situation where it looked like a burglary as well. Now, Pamela then cleaned herself up and gave a stellar performance to the 911 dispatcher as well as the police who arrived on scene. Now, the defense simply argued that the case was pure speculation. They didn't have any definitive proof to point to. And one of the key witnesses for the defense was an accountant who testified that he saw no evidence of theft and confirmed that the books were in fact balanced.
Wow. Now, Steph, real quick before we get more into the prosecution's case, what, in the beginning when you were telling us about how she was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher and he calls down for her, like screams down for her, was the 911 dispatcher able to hear that, or she's just claiming to the 911 dispatcher like, he's calling my name, he wants me to
It
come
was
down?
On that phone call, she just claims you couldn't hear any of the background noise that maybe she was able to hear that was audible on her end. She's simply just telling the 911 dispatcher, my husband's calling down to me. He's telling me to get the gun. So,
Got it. Got it. This accountant's testimony definitely was damning to the prosecution's, argument. The defense brought this insurance agent. He told the jury that he was the one that suggested that Ricky increase the insurance policy. The defense then asked the judge, we want to dismiss the case because they have not proven their case. And one of the things that you guys should know is that the burden of proof to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard in all criminal cases, is the highest burden that we have is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that burden lies with the prosecution. The prosecution goes first in their case. They produce their case in chief. And one of the things that the defense can do is if they feel like the prosecution has not proven their case, they don't even have to get up and argue anything. They can just say, we move to dismiss this case because the prosecution has not proven their burden beyond a reasonable doubt. And the judge can make that decision that, yeah, they haven't, or no, they have. And so the judge in this case, he considers it. Like when they move for the judge to dismiss the case based on the fact that the prosecution has not proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt, the judge does consider it, but he decides to allow the jury to make the ultimate decision and be the triers of fact. And the jury did come back with a verdict and they found Pamela guilty. Now, the judge at that point has a decision, and you guys may not know this, but the judge can throw out the jury's verdict. That's always an option. And in this particular case, the judge wanted to sit with the jury's verdict and make a decision on whether or not he was going to throw it out or keep it. And the judge waited for a month to make his decision. The court during that time was obviously allowed to go home. Pam went home, the jury went home, everybody was able to go their own way. The DA then brings a motion to put Pam back into custody. They're like, she should not be able to be out and about. She's dangerous. She's a danger to society. The judge finally comes back after waiting a month and he decides to affirm the sentence that the jury, she was convicted and was sentenced to life in prison. Now, they did do an appeal and the case was overturned. And during that time, she was granted a new trial in 2017 and she testified. The jury finds her guilty again. Now, Pamela believes that she has suffered a great injustice, but the jury made the decision 2 times in a row.
we're just going to slide right into the takeaway. Sometimes the culprit in crime cases are not as clear cut as we like to think they are. Like, as true crime sleuths, we listen to a case and we're able to say, she did it, he did it, and we know the reason why they did it. But some true crime cases just aren't as clear and cut like that. It's not a neat resolution that we often anticipate when we get to the end of an episode. But I would like to talk about who Ricky was before I emphasize how I was left scratching my head in this case. Ricky, which I believe is more important than anything else we can talk about during Takeaway. Ricky was an inspiring individual. He came to this country to set a path of success, not just for himself, but also for his family. And he did just that. I mean, he had a thriving business, and I would dare to say that he built a legacy for his sons. Now, I don't know if they continued his landscaping business or not, but he definitely built the foundation for them to go forward. And tragically, his life was cut short for reasons that we are not even sure about. And he didn't deserve that. He deserved better, and so did his family. But it goes without saying that we have to discuss that this case, at least for me, And MD has talked about the proof and the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the highest bar. And I think you should take that very seriously when you are doing your due diligence as a civil servant. And for me, I don't know that I was convinced without a reasonable doubt that she committed this murder. And that's not to say that the jury didn't get it right. I didn't hear all the evidence that they heard, but just with what I've researched surrounding this case, I don't know if I could have convicted her. I don't know if it was good enough evidence. But regardless on where you stand, because I'm wanting to know what you guys think about all of the evidence that we presented in this episode, the fact of the matter is Ricky lost his life and he shouldn't have. MD, any thoughts?
Steph, I echo everything that you said. And I think this case leaves me scratching my head as well. Did she do it? Like, I can see how you could think she had the motive,
Right.
but I just don't think, and the motive and the means, because you can have motive, but not the means. She has both. I don't know, Steph. I just feel like in this particular case, the evidence wasn't there. And not only that, the evidence that they did have, which circumstantial evidence is good. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've talked about
We've
that.
talked about it. It's good enough. But in this particular case, even with their circumstantial evidence that we presented, at least here in, on this podcast that we had access to, the defense had a rebuttal, a good rebuttal, a reasonable explanation as to why. And whenever there's a reasonable explanation, I mean, the defense is always going to be crafty and creative to come up with like an explanation. You're going to get an explanation, but does the explanation make sense to a reasonable person? In this
Yeah.
particular case, it was reasonable. Like, yeah, he increased his policy, but it was the insurance guy that suggested that he increase it. It wasn't like, she put a gun to his head and said, go increase it, or she increased it behind his back, and then the accountant says, I didn't even see any evidence of theft. So you're like,
Yikes. I
eesh.
mean, it causes you to question and to scratch your head because you are looking for evidence. But if you have such a good rebuttal, it's like, bro, I don't know.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, but like you said, Steph, this is what I will say that I think you said that really is a big take home that I want our listeners to take home with them as they're listening to this case is we don't have everything and we didn't hear exactly what they heard, right? We don't have the transcript of the trial. We weren't sitting there and heard the evidence. We didn't see how she was sitting there because all of those things matter. And that's something that the jurors are taking in: tone, body behavior, body language, like all of that. Like, to think that she actually gave testimony in her 2017 trial, the jurors got to hear her and they still walked away and said, you're guilty.
Mm-hmm.
We got to trust that they heard something that we don't.
Yeah. So let us know what you guys think about this particular case. We're anxious to hear what your thoughts are. We want to encourage you guys to check us out on all social media platforms. We're on YouTube, we're on Instagram, and we are also on Facebook. Let us know what you think. Give us any case suggestions, and we will see you guys next week. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.